correct?
Into and around, yes.
And those roads that lead around it they're dirt roads, or I guess fill that they use, true?
Those roads I'm not sure of.
But they're not paved.
No, the ones on the exterior are not.
Okay. And the ones in the interior of the landfill, they kind of wrap around these different ponds or cells, true?
Yes, those are, yes.
And there isn't light out there as far as like overhead lights or street lights in this landfill, correct?
There's no lighting out there at the cells.
And you'd have
that I
to,
observed.
Okay. And you'd have to be somewhat familiar with the layout of the landfill to navigate around it. Would that be fair?
I would want to be familiar with it, yes.
Sure. Because there's certain spots where it kind of drops off, correct?
Not on the dikes, but if you enter the cell, there would be drop-offs.
Okay. So let's talk about that. So if you enter one of these cells, it's not like the sludge or the water is up to the rim of the cell. There's a drop-off, correct?
Not necessarily. It depends upon the cells.
Okay.
Some of them are even, some of them are more unstable and do have some drop-offs.
So the ones that are more even are the more stable ones that they're more hardened?
I don't know about if they're hardened because I didn't walk on them. They're just more even in appearance.
Okay. The ones that are a little bit more unstable, there's a drop-off to get into the cell?
I don't know if those are the ones that are unstable. I'm not familiar. I mean, I'm not an expert at that product. Obviously we got tutorials and a field visit, but
sure.
The ones that have drop off, I don't know if they're stable or not. There just are some that have drop offs, and there's others that were flat in appearance.
And the ones that have this drop off, I just want to, whether or not they're stable or not, the ones that have drop off, is it a fairly steep drop off?
The ones that I observed were not steep.
Okay. They're more slanted that you could walk down into?
I wouldn't say that either, no.
Okay. It would be difficult to go down and back up one, you would say, right? For a walk?
If they are the unstable or soft ones, yes.
Okay. And when during the course of your investigation, did you bring any dogs around those cells?
No.
Did you take any drone photos of that cell?
No, we did not.
Okay. And what year did you guys go out and look at these cells?
I believe it was 2019.
2019.
I believe.
Okay. So just by easy math, let's say that's 6 years after Victoria went missing, true?
Yes.
So was there any indication as part of your investigation that the layout of those cells or the ones that were closed were strike that, let me ask the question differently. In 2019, there were cells that were closed that may not have been closed in 2013?
I don't know.
Okay. So they might have been the same cells that were open in 2013 could have been open in 2019?
Correct.
Okay. And just for clarification, there was no evidence at that GP landfill of Victoria Prokopovitz, correct?
I would have no knowledge of that.
In order to get into the GP landfill, you had to have some sort of key to get past the gate, correct?
It was just a regular padlock with a padlock key, like a regular master, a small master padlock with a key to open it. That's all that was needed on a typical wire fencing.
Okay. There was some barbed wire fencing over the top of that, correct?
I don't recall that.
Okay. The key, do you know who had the actual key?
There were numerous keys amongst McKeefrey's employees. that had access to that. On the other side with Georgia Pacific, I would have no idea. All we were informed was there was numerous key-free employees who had keys to that gate.
Did you identify those employees who had the keys in 2013?
No, we did not.
So you don't know whether or not Jim Prokopovitz had a key to that landfill in 2013, correct?
He informed us he did have a key to that landfill at that time.
He informed you that he had access or he had a key?
That he actually had a key.
Okay. Did you verify that that is where the key was kept?
I presume on a key ring that he had for work.
If I recall your testimony, the drone that you flew out at 5118 Coonish Road, you said you went 3 miles out, 2 miles out, 1 mile out, and then just directly above the property, correct?
No,
Nope.
not the drones. That was the air flight, the aircraft.
Oh, you were.
I was in an airplane.
I am sorry, I misunderstood. So you were in an airplane that was 3 miles out, 2 miles out, 1 mile out, and then right above the.
That's correct.
And you were personally taking photos, or was a digital photo that you then looked at?
I was personally capturing the digital images with a camera.
And it's safe to say that 3 miles out is kind of the radius that all the searches was their limit?
That's what we designated as a reasonable distance based on the likelihood of Mrs. Prokopovitz's limitations, as well as what was done with the searches, the original searches by the volunteer searchers.
And the limitations were based on the idea that she had a little bit of a gimpy leg, true?
There's numerous limitations, but that would be one of them.
But you don't know exactly how far somebody could walk if they're intending to disappear, true?
I don't know that.
No further questions, Your Honor.
Redirect.
Sort of go in order here, Special Agent Yerges. So you were asked a question about family members were still searching for answers, and you said yes. Who are you referring to when you replied yes to that question?
Marcia Loritz, Stacey Deer, Wesley Yerges, and their families.
In the 6 years that you were investigating this case, would there sometimes be periods, months where you wouldn't necessarily have an update for the family?
That's correct. Sometimes it was intentional.
Okay. And would, in those instances, be situations where the family would then reach out to you to inquire as to the status of the investigation?
That's correct.
And you said those individuals would be Marcia, would be Stacey, would be Wesley and their families. At any point, was one of those individuals James Prokopovitz?
Mr. Prokopovitz never inquired about the status of the investigation.
You interviewed Mr. Prokopovitz several times in your 6 years investigating the case?
Yes, I did.
And I think you said at one point it was 1 or 2 times a year. Is that right?
That's correct.
So there would be periods of time where you would go 6 months, maybe more, without talking to Mr. Prokopovitz?
Correct.
And in those timeframes, he never once asked you for a status update on the investigation?
Never.
You were asked questions about Victoria potentially using an alias. Based on your, obviously, knowledge of the investigation, you're familiar she didn't have a car at this time, correct?
That's correct.
She didn't have significant mobility at that point, correct?
She did not.
It's a rural area, correct?
Very rural.
There was a reference to her capability of using internet. Based on your training and experience, would somebody need to be pretty savvy and sophisticated to avoid the databases that you're referring to having searched?
100%. And she would have needed extraordinary assistance to be able to accomplish a new or different identity with her limitations.
And you are familiar, based on this investigation, that there wasn't a whole lot of people Victoria was having contact with.
Few, if any.
You've had contact throughout this investigation with Stacey, with Marcia, with Wes. Is that correct?
Yes.
What was your, I guess, observations of their general demeanor?
Collectively,
Yeah.
a very nice, ordinary, hardworking, caring family. They're like all of us, ordinary individuals who love their families, who work hard, earn an honest living. They enjoy each other's companies. They are a very, very pleasant family.
And with respect specifically to Victoria's disappearance, did it appear, based on your observations, that this affected them greatly?
More than you can imagine.
During that same time frame, you had multiple interactions with Mr. Prokopovitz.
That's correct.
Did the observations you've made with respect to the children of Victoria differ from the observations you made of James?
Starkly different.
Can you describe that?
Mr. Prokopovitz was crude, vulgar, uncaring, disinterested, unattached, detached, uninquisitive, wanted no information, didn't want to cooperate, was sick of answering questions. Not what is normal with victim families in my experience.
You were also asked questions about the search area that you participated in, and you participated in the aerial search of the area 3 miles out, 2 miles out, 1 mile out. Is that correct?
Yes, I did.
There was also a reference in the transcripts we read to a 6 or 7 mile radius having been searched. Do you remember that?
Yes.
And you did the aerial search. You're familiar, there were numerous other searches being done, correct?
Yes, I took part in some.
And the reference to a 6 or 7 mile radius having been searched, where did that information come from?
I have no clue. That was not our information from the investigation that I'm aware of.
During, I should ask, were you involved in a search at the residence of Kathy Friday?
Not directly, but indirectly, yes.
You subsequently received evidence collected from that search.
Yes, I did. I facilitated that and coordinated that.
And did you review some of the evidence that was collected in the course of that search?
Yes, I did.
Special Agent, I'm showing you what's been marked Exhibit 115. Do you recognize that?
Yes, I do.
And what is that?
This is the January 22nd, 2014 National Mortgage Settlement Administrator letter that was created by Ms. Friday on behalf of Mr. Prokopovitz.
And you say Ms. Friday wrote it on behalf of Mr. Prokopovitz. Is that information she testified to in the course of the John Doe testimony? She acknowledged writing that letter?
Yes,
Okay. It is, I guess, signed or indicated the letter was written by Mr. Prokopovitz. Is that true?
that's correct. It has his name at the bottom with his original home address.
And does that contain a statement from Mr. Prokopovitz with respect to the search efforts that were done in this case?
Yes,
And in that, did he indicate the extent of the radius of the area that was searched around the Coonish Road residence?
yes, it does.
And what does it indicate?
The searches covered a 7-mile radius of our home.
So the information with respect to a 7-mile radius having been searched around the house came from the defendant?
That's correct.
You were asked a number of questions about the relationship between Kathy and the defendant and the timing of that. And you said the lie goes to the motive. Is it also important from an investigative standpoint, the timing of when that relationship would have started?
Absolutely.
Why is that?
Because it's not typical, or the timing of any action in conjunction with whatever extraordinary event happened reflects the capabilities of what that individual can or doesn't do.
And would that be indicative to you of a sense of an individual, I guess, moving on?
I think it's more extreme than that.
Can you describe that?
It's someone that simply is not grief-stricken, and they are deliberately performing actions that just don't seem like they care or are involved with that other individual. Like I spoke to earlier, there's just a detachment, an insensitivity. It's more than, you know, how you described it.
Sure. So when you're saying, when you referred to earlier, you're referring to the comments regarding that woman.
Correct.
And that would be the way for years Mr. Prokopovitz referred to Victoria.
Yes.
You were asked questions about, I believe that the term used was hard evidence. From an investigative standpoint, if several witnesses independently are telling you a piece of information, is that significant to you?
That is very significant.
That information is consistent? Does that increase the veracity of that information to you?
It absolutely does.
If one of those individuals is a defendant telling you that, does that increase the veracity of that comment?
Absolutely.
You were present for the August 2nd, 2016 interview with Mr. Prokopovitz at his residence where you did the walkthrough with Sergeant Ehrenstein?
Yes.
And in that interview, Mr. Prokopovitz indicated he was speaking with Kathy about discussing Marv's illness. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Illness implying an individual still living at that point,
That's correct.
which based on your knowledge would be predating November 2012.
Correct.
You were asked questions about the sludge ponds. Do you remember those?
Yes.
You were present for the testimony of Rich Jones in this case?
Yes.
The gentleman from Georgia Pacific?
Yes.
Okay. And you recall him indicating the defendant would have had access to the sludge ponds?
That's correct.
You also interviewed Mr. Prokopovitz on May 8th of 2019, correct?
That's correct.
In that interview, he also indicated and admitted he had access to that sludge pond.
Correct.
And he indicated in that interview that if something was, a body was to go into that sludge pond, that it would probably never be found.
That's correct.
The information with respect to Victoria and having a gimpy leg, where did that information come from?
Mr. Prokopovitz.
The information that Victoria was not walking around as usual, where did that information come from?
Mr. Prokopovitz.
Based on your experience, as you indicated, you've worked homicide cases for decades, is that fair?
That's correct.
And that includes no-body homicide cases?
That's correct.
And that includes currently active no-body homicide cases, correct?
That's correct.
Do you believe there's any other reasonable investigative effort that could have been taken to locate Victoria Prokopovitz's remains in any close proximity to the Coonish Road residence?
The efforts were extraordinary and thorough, There is nothing else humanly possible to do on that matter.
Nothing further, Your Honor. Thank you.
Further cross?
Detective, Special Agent, you were just asked, was there any other efforts that could be made at the Kunish Road property? Was there any other efforts that could have been made at the sludge ponds to verify that she was there or not?
There are none.
None that you're aware of? Not with all the technology, no sonar could have been done?
With the description and information that we were informed by the representative from Georgia Pacific, it is literally impossible, cost prohibitive. There is nothing else that can be done with that type of product in that kind of environment.
Even the solidified ones?
It's impossible.
So they couldn't look through sonar or something through the ground to see if there's something buried underneath there?
It's not stable enough to use that type of equipment.
And we've heard a lot about these sniffing dogs that can smell stuff through water and ice and different things. That wasn't attempted?
That environment is not safe for canines.
And you were asked about Mr. Prokopovitch knowing about Marv's sickness in 2012. Isn't it true that what the statement was that he called her every 3, 4, 5 years, correct?
That is his statement, yes.
And wasn't there testimony that Marv was sick for the last 5 years of his life?
Could have been, yes.
So it wouldn't be if he called her every 3, 4, 5 years and Marv was sick during that time, it wouldn't be uncommon for him to say, well, I knew he was sick.
Ms. Friday could have told him that in previous discussions, yes.
Okay. You were asked about updates that the family, and when you didn't have contact with the family would contact you, and you said Marsha or Stacey, but they weren't contacting you, they were contacting Detective Ehrenstein, correct?
There were times when Detective Ehrenstein and myself had direct contact with them during investigative efforts, so they would pose those questions simultaneous to us or while we were together.
Were you aware that Stacey and Marsha were calling Jim and giving him updates about the search efforts?
I don't know that.
So you don't know if they were telling him updates about your investigative efforts either?
I don't know that.
You mentioned the family members. How often did Wes call you and ask for updates?
Mr. Edges never called me.
And you were indicating that, there was times where Jim would get irritated. How many times did you or Detective Ehrenstein ask him if he did it?
Several.
How many times does somebody have to say no before you believe them?
There's no number.
No further question.
Thank you. You're excused. Further witnesses by the state?
Excuse me, Your Honor, no, we have no further witnesses. We have to move for the admission of a couple last exhibits. We are withdrawing 8, 9, and 10. 14 and 16.
Could you use the microphone?
Sure.
Thank you.
I said 8, 9, 10 are being withdrawn, and 14 and 16, there were extra photos. With respect to 23, We're going to withdraw that. And then it looks like the others, I think the defense was withdrawing 30. And the state and defense used some statements for refreshing recollection, which would be, and we're withdrawing these, would be 38. $50, $52, $54, and $55. Also, both parties were using the reports in 80 and 81 for refreshing recollection, so we'd withdraw those as well. And we are withdrawing 79. We are moving for the admission of the last exhibit. I believe it's 115.
Any objection to 115?
No objection to 115, Your Honor.
115 is admitted.
Your Honor, I would move for the admission of 30. Other than that, I think I withdrew 107, but if I hadn't officially on the record, I'd withdraw 107.
Can I see 30, Your Honor?
It's on the table. And Your Honor, I misspoke. I will withdraw 30. Sorry. Yes. Your Honor, I'm sorry. I clarify. I will withdraw 30. I apologize.
Are there any further motions to admit by the state?
I'm sorry, what?
Are there any further motions to admit exhibits by the state?
No, not at this time. We're just checking. And I think, I just confirm with the clerk, that should address all of them? Doesn't. Would move for the admission of 92, 94, and 95. They were offered substantively and used by both parties.
No objection, Your Honor.
92, 94, and 95 are admitted.
Sorry, there's a lot of exhibits. We just want to make sure.
No, that's fine.
I think that should be all of them. And at this time, preserving a right to bring a rebuttal case, the state would rest at this time.
All right. Jurors, then, the state has rested. We're going to take a 10-minute recess. Be seated. Attorney D'Angelo, do you want me to conduct a colloquy with your client now, or do you need time during the recess to discuss any further issues with him?
No, Your Honor. I discussed the issue yesterday with Mr. Prokopovitz, and you can initiate the colloquy.
All right. Mr. Prokopovitz, Do you understand that you have an absolute constitutional right not to testify?
Yes, I do.
And has your client indicated to you that if you elect not to testify, he can request an instruction that the court reads to the jurors? And I'll just read it over here. In fact, there's a jury instruction for the defendant electing not to testify. It reads as follows. A defendant in a criminal case has the absolute constitutional right not to testify. The defendant's decision not to testify must not be considered by you in any way and must not influence your verdict in any manner. If your counsel so requests, that will be read to the jurors. Do you understand that?
Yes, I do, Your Honor.
But now conversely, you have an absolute right to testify, and that's your decision. Have you discussed with your attorney the issue of testifying or not testifying?
Yes, I have, Your
And
Honor.
have you had enough time for that conversation?
I have, Your Honor.
And has he answered any questions or concerns you have on either side of the issue?
He has, Your Honor.
Okay. So knowing that you have a constitutional right not to testify, knowing you can get the reading of a instruction to the jury, and knowing you also have a right to testify if you so elect, I should further explain that I cannot compel you to testify, the state cannot compel you to testify, and neither could your attorney compel you to testify. Do you understand that?
I do, Your Honor.
All right. Then what have you elected to do, sir?
Not testify.
All right. Counsel, were you satisfied that your client understood your explanation about his constitutional right?
I do, Your Honor.
And did you have sufficient time to discuss the issue with your client?
I have, Your Honor.
All right. Then I'll find your client, Mr. Prokopovitz's decision not to testify and is made knowingly and voluntarily. All right. Do you want then a recess before the defense proceeds then? I imagine the jurors are going to have about 10 minutes, and we should probably also take a 10-minute recess in case anyone needs the short break. Anything further we want on the record outside the presence of the jurors?
Your Honor, I think for appellate purposes, it would be the defense, after the state has rested, to move for a directed verdict, at least on the first-degree intentional homicide, if you want to hear arguments. Or would you prefer to do that just before the jurors are reconvened?
You have a preference, Ms. Lemkool?
No. I guess I'm,
Why don't we take the arguments now then?
sure.
Go ahead, Attorney D'Angelo.
Your Honor, in this case, the state has the burden of proof on a first-degree intentional homicide that the defendant caused the death of Victoria Prokopovitz, and the defendant acted with the intent to kill. Intent to kill means that he had the mental purpose to take the life of another, or his awareness that the death was practically certain as a result. The state has provided evidence to the extent that they believe that Ms. Prokopovitz is dead, but they haven't provided any sort of acknowledgement or recognition that there was an intent to kill her. There is, arguably, they're suggesting motive, they're arguably suggesting emotion to be enforced, to say that there was this happened, but there hasn't been any evidence that there was an actual mental state of intending to kill Victoria Prokopovitz in this case. A mental state has to be warranted in order to reach a first-degree intentional homicide. With that, Your Honor, I don't believe that the state has met their burden of proof with regards to the mental capacity that Mr. Prokopovitz had a mental state to intending to kill his wife, or that he killed his wife at all, and that's why we're moving for a directed verdict.
State's argument?
Thank you, Your Honor. As the court is aware, as Attorney D'Angelo indicated, there are two elements. The defendant caused the death of Victoria Prokopovitz. Cause means his actions were a substantial factor. And second, the defendant acted with the intent to kill her. Intent to kill means the defendant had the mental purpose to take the life of another human being, or was aware that his conduct was practically certain to cause the death of another human being. Intent is something under the law and explained in the jury instruction, that it's something that the act need not be brooded over, considered, or reflected upon a week, a day, an hour, or even a minute. There need not be any appreciable time between the formation of the intent and the act. The intent to kill can be formed at any time before the act, including the instant before the act, and must continue to exist at the time of the act. Quite frankly, with anything else not being in the record, there's overwhelming circumstantial evidence with respect to this case. There were extensive searches. We have to show that Ms. Prokopovitz is dead. There is no reasonable explanation beyond a reasonable doubt for this woman not to have appeared with what has been done basically in the physical searches based upon the lack of contact, based upon the lack of existence, and quite sadly, 8 years of time passing substantiates that rather clearly. We're not talking about a day, a week, a month. Based upon that information, and most importantly, the statements of this defendant that he made to not only the searchers from the beginning, that she's gone, you're wasting your time, she's not coming back, Marcia testifying she's dead, to witness 1 and witness 2, who he indicated to separate times, separately, that he's 100% certain she's dead. You're not 100% certain unless you were involved in that, and that she was not coming back, and that law enforcement would not find her. And even if they did, there would be no blood, there would be no teeth, there would be no way of identifying her. I think the circumstantial evidence in this case is overwhelming with respect to that. Throw in his prior history of assaultive conduct to a previous wife, and eerily telling her, you're not going to get out of here alive, and witness 2 saying that Jim Prokopovitz said to him that there was a dispute where till death do us part, depart, and that he indicated that she would not leave him if she weren't in a garbage bag. Hearing all of that information on a no-body homicide, the intent comes from the fact that there is no other explanation. If you are getting rid of somebody and you are getting rid of their body, that is intentional. At this juncture, based upon the motion before the court, the status under the law is that the court is to see the evidence in the light most favorable to the state. I think with the circumstantial evidence in this case, which led to some direct evidence in other areas, that it overwhelmingly shows that Mr. Prokopovitz could be believed to be responsible for count 1. We are asking the court to deny the motion.
For the argument, Mr. D'Angelo?
Well, Your Honor, I don't think the evidence is overwhelming. There are some statements. They are relying on some reaction and emotion that they are suggesting that he had the mental purpose because of something that happened 40 years ago with a previous wife who left him. But there's also evidence of the fact that she stayed around after this alleged domestic incident occurred and also left the children with him. So if he was such a violent individual, quite frankly, why would you leave your children? I think that's a red herring in the argument that he is a violent individual and that all of a sudden, after 20-some years of marriage to a woman who he's dealt with on a daily basis, with who herself has mental illness and suicidal thoughts, would all of a sudden get upset with her over a tablecloth. Quite frankly, Your Honor, I don't think that there was evidence that he had a mental purpose on that night or any other night of intending to kill his wife or that he killed his wife at all.
Counsel, do you agree that the standard at this time for this motion is that I must consider the evidence in a light most favorable to the state? I also must consider all reasonable inferences that are favorable towards the state?
Your Honor, excuse me, I would agree that that is the correct standard in the state of Wisconsin.
Attorney Lemkool?
Yes.
And I agree, I concur that is the standard. At this time, when the court views the entire body of evidence in a light most favorable to the state, as well as with all reasonable inferences, the court finds I must respectfully deny the motion.
Thank you, Your Honor.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
All right, we'll take a recess then, and court stands in recess, 10 minutes.
Thank you.